Nothing to My Name was the first song he ever heard that really seemed to be in a Chinese voice. And he wasn't alone. Coming home to Guizhou in the holidays, he found his old school friends were singing it too. They swaggered down the street at night, roaring drunk, singing it at the top of their lungs. It was how they felt, that they had nothing to their name, no direction and no way to express what they felt. And then this song had come along, and they realized they weren't alone. 3 years later, students would be singing it in Tiananmen Square. I don't think it was by chance that Cui Jiang came along when he did, Guo Jian told me one day. At that time, there was so much going on, new books, new ideas. The time was ripe. Cui Jiang was conjured up by people's needs. You wanted to express yourself. You wanted to make noise, and Cui Jiang brought us together to make noise. He was our Bob Dylan. I first heard Nothing to My Name sung in a cappella in Monker's tiny apartment one night in the early summer of 1986. Midway through a drunken dinner, a skinny guy with high cheekbones and weathered skin swayed to his feet and began to sing. At first I thought it was a folk song, as it had that kind of raw simplicity. But I soon knew this was no folk song. Around the low table people beat time, urging him on, and in the final verse they joined in. Oh, you will go with me. You will go with me. It was exhilarating. We applauded and then toasted the moment with beer and ergoto. I asked the nearest person to write down the lyrics for me in my notebook, and later I spent hours deciphering the characters until I had my own rough translation. I carried the piece of paper with me for years, even after the events of June 1989 leached the words of all their triumphant joy. Monker's apartment was up several flights of gray concrete steps in a characterless building in a remote part of town. Harshly lit and minimally furnished, it was also one of the most exciting places in Beijing. Ever since he had first started writing poetry, Monker had attracted people around him, but his work with Today had made him a legend. Beidao and Huang Rui had both left the country, but Monker remained. Aspiring artists, poets, dreamers, and random foreigners sought him out, and he received us generously, though not indulgently. Conversation was always vital around him. Suddenly I found myself having to have opinions again on T.S. Eliot or Albert Camus or Nietzsche or Freud, subjects I hadn't felt passionate about since I was a teenager. Encountering them again in Beijing in those days, their works hit me afresh. It seemed like every foreigner was treated as an emissary. I found myself thinking more deeply about my own culture than I had ever done before. Poetry came easily then, too. People got up to read their work as naturally as they would get up and sing. You would find yourself at poetry parties, the best of them held in the ruins of the old summer palace beyond the university district beneath the fragrant hills. A group of vagabond poets lived there, renting tumble-down rooms from farmers who cultivated crops among the fallen stones of what had been once a grand pleasure garden for the Qing emperors. You'd swig mouthfuls of burning strong ergoto and lie on your back and look at the stars, the words reeling in your head. On warm nights, you would sleep outside and in the morning cycle back into town in a dream. In those days, I'd often find lines of Western poetry humming in my head, as powerful as if they had been written for that moment. On a seemingly endless loop came the famous couplet from Wordsworth, The French Revolution as it appeared to enthusiasts at its commencement. Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive. To be young was very heaven. It was bliss, and I missed entirely the warning in the title. Leaving Monker's place or the old summer palace was always disorienting. On the surface, the city seemed not to be changing at all. The stately bicycles still dominated the roads. Clerks still napped, heads on their arms, on the counters of the state-owned stores. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs still held their surreally uninformative press conferences weekly, without fail, and most of the city was shuttered and dark by 6 p.m. That was when the other Beijing came to life. In those years, I often felt that my existence was a black-and-white movie that only flared into color after dark. Much of my journalistic round focused on the stream of businessmen, legitimate and carpetbaggers alike, who were flocking to China in search of a fortune, or on the revolving door of world leaders coming to pay court. Every few days, a new national flag would be hoisted alongside China's on Chang'an Avenue, and China Daily would feature yet another headline hailing China's ties with yet another nation. One day it would be the Pakistan relationship that was going from strength to strength. Then a few days later, it would be New Zealand's turn or Zimbabwe's. Queen Elizabeth II came calling too. She arrived by plane, but the royal yacht met her in Shanghai, where she threw a lavish shipboard banquet, much to the chagrin of the trade officials of less favored countries. Hard to compete with the yacht, they muttered. Covering these visits could be fun, notably the Queen's arrival, which found me throwing back a supercharged gin and tonic at 11 a.m. at a special drinks party for the Commonwealth Press Corps. But there was a sense that most of the business stories in those days were going nowhere. It would be some time before foreign companies and governments discovered how best to work the angles to profit from China's opening. But all of that was just a sideshow besides the momentousness of China's transformation. We were witnessing a movement of people and an economic upheaval to rival the Industrial Revolution. It was irresistible to look to history for clues as to what this might mean. Releasing farmers from the communes, promoting private enterprise and encouraging a free flow of workers to the cities and to the new special economic zones seemed to guarantee a rise in China's people's autonomy and a loosening of the control of the Communist Party. We looked to countries like Britain, where industrialization had led to the rise of the middle class, the establishment of trade unions, a free media, non-government organizations, and other hallmarks of a civil society, and ultimately to parliamentary democracy. Surely China would go the same way. The opening up of China's economy and society became visible to us in small ways every day. A new freewheeling class of independent small traders, known as the Gotihu, appeared across the city, repairing shoes and bicycles, tailoring colorful clothes made to measure, roasting sweet potatoes and chestnuts on upturned oil drums, and hawking candied apples, pinwheels, and brilliantly colored kites. Free markets popped up near the diplomatic compounds and out near the Beijing Zoo, selling clothes that had mysteriously slipped out of the export stream and onto makeshift stalls on dusty patches of parkland, many of which sheltered a brisk black market in foreign exchange as well. Farmers would suddenly appear by the road selling types of fruits and vegetables that hadn't been seen in the city in decades. I can still remember the excitement when a pedal cart laden with strawberries was sighted, trundling into town along the Third Ring Road. In the following days, I ate strawberries everywhere. Today they are a regular part of spring in the capital, but then they seemed like they came from another world. We believed in the flow of Western ideas, and liberalization was unstoppable. The anti-spiritual pollution campaign was officially condemned as a mistake, a piece of overreach by the old guard that had foundered once it was seen to threaten economic reforms and relations with the West. There was a freer tone in the media, too, not just in cultural magazines, but in bold experiments such as the World Economic Herald in Shanghai, which pushed for deeper reforms. Adding to our optimism was that, as far as we could tell, Deng Xiaoping's leadership team was pragmatic and outward-looking, too. Both the General Secretary of the Communist Party, Hu Yaoban, and Premier Zhao Ziyang wore their commitment to the open-door policy on their sleeves of their Western suits. It was pretty clear that Hu Yaoban had run dead on the anti-spiritual pollution campaign, and that he welcomed, rather than feared, foreign influences. Zhao Ziyang had been an early pioneer of the reforms that had liberated China's farmers from the communes, and he was known to favor giving more power to managers throughout the economy to run their enterprises without party interference. We believed we were witnessing the gradual retreat of the party from Chinese people's lives, both in policy and in the personal style of the leaders. Hu Yaoban was seen openly reading a newspaper at dull political events, while Zhao Ziyang was fond of golf. Zhao's daughter worked as an events manager at a Western hotel. But in all our calculations, we were too complacent. We could see how profoundly Deng Xiaoping's reforms were exposing the hollowness of the communist project in China, laying bare how little it had achieved and how much had been destroyed in the process. But we failed to see how destabilizing that would be. We could join in the jokes about the party's official verdict on Mao Zedong, that he had been 7 parts good and 3 parts bad, laughing when our Chinese friends would say that surely the formula was the wrong way round. But we didn't consider how wrenching such a verdict would be for the people who had grown up being taught to venerate Mao and honor the party. We didn't see how the disillusionment would hit the country's youth as they were told to put aside one set of ideals and be given nothing to replace them but slogans like, "To get rich is glorious." I failed to hear the desperation in "nothing to my name." They had stripped naked on a freezing day and bound themselves in surgical bandages, then draped themselves in white and black cloth. Dressed in the traditional colors of mourning, they drenched each other in red paint, which dripped from their bodies like blood. In white, black, and red, the colors of death and violence, they walked through the campus like mourners out of hell. As they walked, they screamed out the names of icons of China's culture, the Great Wall and the Yangtze River, yelling the names as if those of the dead. The performance happened in December 1986 at an art festival organized by Peking University. When 4 young students from off-campus had offered to create an artwork, the authorities saw no reason to turn them down. But when they saw the result, they were appalled. What did it mean? Among the 4 students was Shengqi. He had arrived in Beijing in the late summer of 1984, hyped up with excitement, but he had become quickly disillusioned with art school. He had expected his teachers to be how he'd imagined artists would be, with strong, creative, open-minded personalities, but they were just like his parents. They had the same haircuts and the same clothes. He had expected them to be exceptional, but they were no different to every other adult he'd met. Many, in fact, were members of the Communist Party. Realism was all the rage at his school then, or at least the approved version of realism. The teachers would take their students to the seaside or to some picturesque village in the countryside to capture real life. Real life, Shengqi scoffed to one of his friends. Why do we have to do that? We grew up in the city. We have our own problems, our own life. Why do we have to go to a village for inspiration? Inspiration is inside us. It's in our daily life. We don't have to go to some exotic place to find it. He started to ask himself what art really was, burying himself in books and tracing the movements that had driven Western art, seeking out the poets who had inspired him, like Munker and Beidao, and meeting young artists like my friend from the Friendship Hotel party who had already dropped out of the system. All through our schooling, we had been fed this revolutionary, romantic, heroic story, and all of us wanted to be heroes. We wanted to make history and be loyal to our country. We were told that our country equaled our government, that it equaled the state, and we should be loyal to that. We had been brainwashed for more than 20 years. Yet deep inside, we still wanted to be heroes. We still wanted to make history. It was clear to him that the system had to be broken, but he had no idea how. At that time, we didn't even have the basic knowledge or information about what society truly was. We had no point of comparison. We didn't really know about Western culture. All we knew was communist China. As students, we were so powerless. We were so weak that we had to shout. Ordinary art would be meaningless, so we decided to make this kind of demonstration. Years later, I asked him what they were mourning for that day. We were mourning for our culture, for traditional culture, for traditional morals, for the traditional philosophy of China. The students felt they had lost so much which they had never had the chance to know. We chose the strongest colors, we shouted, we were extreme, all because we were the opposite. We were powerless and hopeless. That day they embodied a right to be seen that was extreme, and those who witnessed their performance were shocked. But in their basic motivation, they were not alone. Around the country in December 1986, thousands of students were also mobilizing to be heard. The demonstrations began in Shengqi's hometown of Hefei. Since 1980, students have been trying to exercise the limited democratic rights promised under China's constitution. That document established a 4-tier system of people's congresses designed to represent Chinese citizens from the village to the national level. Delegates to the congresses at the county, provincial, and national level were elected by the representatives of the tier below them, with representatives at the bottom tier elected directly by the people at the village level. In theory, anyone could stand for election to these village congresses, yet despite students around the country waging successful campaigns for election in 1980, 1982, and 1984, the party had stepped in each time to impose their own candidates. In 1986, the students in Hefei had had enough. On December 5th, and then again a few days later, around 3,000 students rallied in the city under banners that recalled the words of Wei Jingshen. No democratization, no modernization. A few days later, 5,000 students were marching in the industrial city of Wuhan in the neighboring province of Hubei. Reports filtered in of protests in remote places like the far southern city of Kunming and the special economic zone of Shenzhen. 2 weeks later, on December 20th, some 30,000 students marched down the Bund in Shanghai, behind banners declaring, "Give us democracy" and "Long live freedom," while at least another 30,000 Shanghai residents rallied in support. By then, the list of grievances had extended to issues such as corruption and broader calls for democracy and freedom of speech. On the night of December 23rd, just hours after Shengqi and his three friends brought their own kind of demonstration to Peking University, protests broke out in the neighboring University of Tsinghua, with thousands rallying in the university quarter. Over the coming days, students from other campuses, including Peking University, joined in. Peking University had a tradition of being in the vanguard of social movements. It was there in the early decades of the 20th century that the New Culture movement was launched, seeking to free China from the feudal influences of Confucianism in favor of a new culture based on democracy and science. It was the students from Peking University who rallied in 1919 against the Treaty of Versailles, which handed German territorial holdings in China to the Japanese. This was a trigger for the so-called May 4th movement, the leaders of which would go on to found the Chinese Communist Party. Less honorably, but more recently, Peking University had been a center of action during the early days of the Cultural Revolution. In the days leading up to New Year's Eve, posters went up at Peking University proposing that the students should rally in Tiananmen Square, a dramatic escalation. The posters argued that taking their protests to the heart of the capital would signal their intention to lead the promotion of democracy in China, as the government had failed to do so. Everyone knew that a successful demonstration at the square would elevate the students' movement to a different level. It was at Tiananmen Square in 1919 that the May 4th movement was born. It was there that the Red Guards had come to receive the blessings of Mao Zedong in the summer of 1966. And it was there that ordinary Beijingers had demonstrated in the morning of Zhou Enlai at Qingming in 1976. New Year's Day 1987 was one of the coldest days of a bitterly cold winter. Dozens of police staked out Tiananmen Square, and early that morning, a water truck sprayed the flagstones to create a treacherous sheet of ice. The students arrived in small groups and formed into lines near the square. They waited until they were several hundred strong, then rushed the police lines. But once on the square, they couldn't maneuver on the ice, and within minutes, dozens had been thrown into police vans. That afternoon, it seemed the students had been defeated. It was impossible to discover how many were under arrest and what they might be charged with. There was talk of a few students being taken away for education and interrogation. Back at Peking University, thousands began to gather. Outraged at the arrests, students who had been reluctant to join the earlier demonstration determined that they should march again on the square to demand their classmates' release. At midnight, they set out on the long march from the university district in the west to the center of the city, their numbers swollen to around 5,000. On the way, the news came through that their classmates had been released without charge, and the students returned triumphantly to their campus. In the immediate days following, the government no doubt thought they had pulled off a good result. They had given the students in Beijing a win, but not a substantive one. And with the end-of-term examinations and Chinese New Year approaching, students across China would have little appetite for more marching. The government hadn't needed to engage directly with any of the issues, and they had brought themselves time to regroup. But the students had made dissent visible again for the first time since Democracy Wall, and the uncomfortable message for the leadership was that China's educated youth were significantly out of sympathy with the Communist Party's directions and ideals. In Shanghai, they had seen how easily the students could make allies of ordinary citizens and workers who may have felt less passionate about democracy but were concerned about the downsides of the reforms: inflation, income inequality, and corruption. Writing about the demonstrations in a piece for Australia's Times on Sunday, I found myself uneasy. I noted how the students seemed to have fallen in love with their own image in the glare of Western media attention. I could see how readily they picked up on the references and descriptions that the Western press used. The students saw themselves exercising people power and standing for civil rights, and they could imagine how their struggle linked them with the Western student movements of 1968. I worried about how this might influence them in the future. Nevertheless, when I filed the piece, I felt relieved that the demonstrations had ended well. But within less than a fortnight, it was clear they had not ended well at all. News filtered through of troublemakers being arrested around the country, among them a young poet I had partied with at the Old Summer Palace just months before. He was no counter-revolutionary, just a romantic spirit with a penchant for Nietzsche, who had been caught up in the excitement. Meanwhile, high-profile and popular liberals, such as the vice president of Hefei's University of Science and Technology, Feng Lizhi, and crusading journalist Liu Bingyang, were sacked from their jobs and expelled from the Communist Party. It seemed that the authorities wanted to send a message to the students without risking attacking them directly. Then on January 16th, amid a rising tide of denunciations of the evils of bourgeois liberalization, it was announced that Hu Yaoban had resigned and had been forced to make a humiliating self-criticism. We did not know it then, but Hu Yaoban had been vulnerable for a long time. As General Secretary of the Communist Party, he was responsible for upholding the party's principles, but, unlike the conservatives within the party and indeed Deng Xiaoping himself, who did not consider liberalization and the influence of Western ideas as a threat, he repeatedly ran dead when asked to crack down on liberals within party ranks, and had shown little zeal for the campaign against spiritual pollution. Now the whole blame for the student demonstrations was laid at his feet. Scapegoating Hu Yaoban may have been satisfying to his conservative rivals, but to blame the demonstrations on ideological laxity was to fatally miss the point. The government and the party itself were facing a crisis of legitimacy. Economic reforms promised greater prosperity and greater autonomy, yet for many students and city dwellers, such promises seemed remote. They were longing for greater control over their lives and for avenues to make their needs heard, and instead were left frustrated and thwarted. As winter turned to spring, we hunkered down to wait out the campaign against bourgeois liberalization. We were confident it wouldn't last long. The reform and opening up of China's economy required an engagement with the West and a retreat from ideology, and we knew that Zhao Ziyang, now installed as head of the party in Hu Yaoban's place, was committed to reform. My Chinese friends felt they'd seen it all before. They had lived through the crackdown after Democracy Wall and the anti-spiritual pollution campaign too. They would just have to fade back again into an underground where they could continue to be free. We Westerners assumed it would be a temporary reversal. We believed we knew the way history was heading, and that time was on the reformer side. Friends in the diplomatic corps advised me that it would be a good idea to lie low for a while, and perhaps cut contact with my friends in the underground. But I knew that without them, I would lose touch with what was really going on in the city. Through them, too, I knew I could get closest to the emotional landscape of the time. And anyway, they were my friends. As a concession, I decided to be more discreet. In a city where public transport stopped early and taxis didn't cruise the streets, I got into a habit of sleeping over at my friends' places at the end of evenings together, leaving in the morning once the workday had begun. In early 1971, I was no longer staying at the relatively free-wheeling Friendship Hotel, but instead in the diplomatic compound at the western end of Chang'an Avenue. I knew that the guards on the gate and the lift operators kept careful note of our comings and goings. If I made a habit of not coming home at night, they might start to take more of an interest in where I was spending my time. Getting home at the end of an evening was easier said than done, with most of my friends living a long hike away from Chang'an Avenue, where you could usually find a taxi at one of the hotels. One night, as I made my way home with a friend through the empty streets, we saw an army truck lumbering towards us down the road. A little tipsy, we decided to wave it down. To our amazement, it stopped. "Where are you going?" the driver yelled down over the sound of the engine. We told him. "Hop in," he said cheerfully. "I'll give you a lift." We scrambled up into the cab of the truck and set off. On our way, he told us he was from the country and was now based in the west of Beijing, out near Fragrant Hills. Being in the army was okay, he said, though he liked driving best. At the compound, he brushed off our thanks. "Serve the people," he replied with a smile, quoting the old Maoist slogan, and we all laughed. Later, my friends told me that since the Korean War, soldiers were widely referred to as China's 最可爱的人, the most beloved people. Our driver's cheery generosity was a typical example of why. Later, I would wonder what happened to that young soldier and where he had been in 1989 when the army rolled into Beijing. In the spring of 1987, getting a ride home in an army truck just seemed like one of those things that could happen only in China, part of the endearing anarchy of the place. Now, like so much about the 1980s, it seems almost unimaginable. Chapter 5. a terrible beauty. At noon on May 15, 1989, the Soviet President, Mikhail Gorbachev, landed at Beijing Airport. It was the first visit by a Russian leader to China in 30 years. Gorbachev had come to the Chinese capital for a historic summit to bury the long-standing rift between the two communist giants. In the early years of the People's Republic, Soviet money and expertise had poured into the country, transforming China's industry, infrastructure, arts, architecture, and education. But within a decade, the relationship had soured. China chafed at its role as little brother to the USSR, was disillusioned when Nikita Khrushchev, leader of the Soviet Union from 1955 to 1964, failed to support China in its disputes with Indonesia and India, and rejected the Soviet notion of peaceful coexistence with the West. In 1960, the Soviet Union withdrew all its experts from China, abandoning hundreds of projects and taking with them the nuclear expertise they had promised to share. Now in the spring of 1989, Gorbachev had arrived to pay court to China and its paramount leader, Deng Xiaoping. It was a huge story, and media from around the world had flown to cover it. Both communist leaders fascinated the West, each with their separate programs to reform and open up their massive countries. Deng and Gorbachev had become poster boys for progress, each separately crowned as Time magazine's Man of the Year. Their summit was supposed to be a great moment in history, but history was to upstage it. Reporters flying into Beijing found a city not in the grip of preparations for an historic summit, but enthralled to quite a different drama. As Gorbachev touched down, instead of columns of soldiers and photogenic children arrayed to meet him in the heart of the city, there were some 2,000 students on a hunger strike and 500,000 Beijingers lending them support. Gorbachev was welcomed in a hurried ceremony on the tarmac at Beijing Airport and forced to enter the Great Hall of the People on Tiananmen Square by a back entrance when he arrived to meet Deng Xiaoping. That week, the media feeds from Beijing were full of students' demonstrations, and the summit was reduced to a footnote. As a visiting CNN reporter put it in his broadcast, "We came here to report a summit, and we walked into a revolution." In the square, the students made posters in Russian greeting the Soviet leader and petitioned the Soviet embassy for a chance to meet with the great man. Guo Jian, who had joined the hunger strike, read with excitement an article on the prophecies of Nostradamus that was circulating among the students. It claimed the Soviet leader's rise had been foretold and that it presaged massive change in both China and the USSR. Guo Jian wasn't superstitious, but in those superheated days of May, he began to wonder whether maybe it was all meant to be. Irrespective of prophecy, he was ready to stand up. All my life I had lived in fear, and I thought by joining the demonstrations, by joining the hunger strike, that it was my chance to throw off fear. This was what we were fighting for. I just didn't want to live in fear anymore. Meanwhile, Deng Xiaoping gathered the Chinese leadership at his home on the morning of May 17th. The demonstrations had been going on for a month, and China now had been humiliated in the eyes of the world. The morning after shaking Gorbachev's hand and formally ending the Sino-Soviet split, Deng Xiaoping made the decision to impose martial law. The hinge year of Chinese contemporary history is 1989. Looking back, you can see how events from the beginning of reform and opening up in 1978 rushed toward the denouement of June 1989, and how everything since can be seen in relation to that moment, either as a reckoning with, a reaction to, or a retreat from the time before. Today, people in China refer to before 1989 or after 1989 as routinely as an earlier generation in the West might have referred to before and after World War I. There is the same acceptance that June 4th, 1989 marked an end, after which nothing would ever be the same again. The events of 1989, like World War I, were long in the making. They were coming from the moment Democracy Wall was closed down and Wei Jingsheng was imprisoned 10 years earlier. Those actions had simply deferred the showdown between the government and the governed about what kind of nation China was meant to be. The students and citizens who rallied in Tiananmen Square in 1989 may have only had a hazy idea of what democracy might mean, but they knew what they wanted: greater respect from their government and a greater say in the running of their country. They wanted a dialogue, to no longer be treated as supplicants, but as equals. The demonstrations were sparked by the death of Hu Yabang in April that year. as with the death of Zhou Enlai in 1976, whose passing would serve both as a catalyst and a cover. Tension had been winding tighter for more than a year. When Hu Yaban died, it was like the crack from a starter's gun, signaling that an event long anticipated could at last begin. In the summer of 1988, the national network China Central Television, CCTV, broadcast a series called River Elegy. Originally conceived as a conventional celebration of the Yellow River as the cradle of Chinese civilization, the project was entrusted to an iconoclastic young director who transformed it into a blistering critique of the backwardness of Chinese culture and a call to arms. In River Elegy, the Yellow River was presented not as a symbol of China's ancient civilization, but instead as a metaphor for its decline. The river was silted up and sluggish. The culture it represented sclerotic, moribund, insular, and feudal, doomed unless it embraced modernity and openness as represented by the West. China could not produce another great civilization, the series argued, if it relied on its old ways. It needed to pursue industrialization, free trade, greater economic reform, and, it hinted, political reform if it was to be reborn. The iconoclasm did not stop with the Yellow River. The Great Wall, according to River Elegy, did not embody strength, but insularity and fear. The dragon, the greatest of Chinese symbols, was not noble and powerful, but tyrannical and cruel. River Elegy was like a hand grenade thrown into the debate about China's identity. 200 million people watched it across the country, and the Communist Party's official paper, the People's Daily, published the scripts in full. Scores of literary salons have been popping up in universities across the country to foster discussion about the future direction of China, and now River Elegy became a key text in stimulating debate and engendering a sense of urgency and crisis. The series argued that in the absence of a middle class, it was from China's intellectuals that the momentum for change should come. Students throughout the country believed that it was up to them to respond. Conservatives in the leadership were appalled. It was clear that the series supported the reformers in the government. Footage of Zhao Ziyang appeared when the series struck a positive or dynamic note, while Mao Zedong was seen when the mood was dark. When CCTV wanted to rebroadcast the series later that year, major cuts were made, but it was too late. The genie was out of the bottle. 1988 was a fevered year of surging inflation and increasingly visible corruption. Price reform had been botched, setting off panic buying and hoarding. People well placed in the system exploited the difference between state and market prices, making fortunes in the process, while workers' wages were being eaten by inflation. Across the country there were scattered strikes. Meanwhile, students discovered that a place at university no longer guaranteed you a job. The old system of job assignments on graduation may have been stultifying, but at least it had provided some sense of security. While people with connections scored lucrative jobs in the special economic zones, those without struggled to find decent jobs at all. A popular saying captured their predicament: as poor as a professor, as dumb as a PhD. Everywhere there was a sense of agitation and stress. A frustrated population of Chinese youths looking for a place in the world were more than ready to answer a call to arms. That 1989 should be a landmark year in China was almost overdetermined. It marked 200 years since the French Revolution, 70 since the launch of the May 4th movement, 40 years since the founding of the People's Republic, and 10 years since Deng Xiaoping's triumphant trip to the United States, which had heralded China's opening to the West. It would prove to be China's year of living dangerously, as the party and the people competed to seize the symbolism of the times. In January, Feng Lizhi, the liberal scientist who had been sacked from his job and expelled from the party for his role in the 1986 student demonstrations, wrote an open letter to Deng Xiaoping. He proposed that in honor of the anniversaries of the May 4th movement and the founding of the People's Republic, and in the spirit of the ideas of the French Revolution, an amnesty should be declared for political prisoners in China, and in particular, that Wei Jingsheng should be finally released. Wei had been in prison for 10 years, but he had not been forgotten. During the student demonstrations in 1986, posters had appeared declaring rhetorically, "If you want to know what freedom is, just go ask Wei Jingsheng." He was no longer just a man, but a symbol. A few weeks after Feng Lizhi published his open letter, Beidao rallied 32 writers, academics, and artists to sign a petition in support. Addressed to the leadership of the National People's Congress and the Communist Party, it called for a general pardon of political prisoners and, specifically, the release of Wei Jingshan. The response from China's leaders was silence, while spokespeople down the food chain batted the issue aside. As China had no political prisoners, they said, there could be no question of amnesty. Meanwhile, passionate discussion about China's future bubbled up in the university salons. There were debates about deeper economic reform and democratic participation, about freedom of speech, and about corruption and nepotism. There were debates about the very nature of Chinese culture. At Peking University, the salons were often attended by Feng Lizhi, who expounded his idea that democracy was not something that could be handed down from above, but instead must be fought for from below. Among those who listened were students who went on to be the leaders of the movement at Tiananmen Square. Around the country, scores of unofficial art groups had sprung up too, from the tough Manchurian city of Harbin in the north to the subtropical special economic zone of Xiamen in the south. The young artists ganged together, encouraging each other to push the limits of their art. Much of the work was surreal or unnerving, or sometimes simply absurd. The year 1989 was an anniversary for them too. It was 10 years since the stars had hung their work outside the National Art Museum in Beijing. Now, artists from around the country had been invited to exhibit inside the museum in a major show boldly called China Avant-Garde. The young curators had chosen more than 100 artists and 250 works to introduce Chinese contemporary art to the nation and the world. The logo for the exhibition was a sign indicating no U-turn, signaling boldly in red, white, and black that there would be no turning back now for China's avant-garde. On the morning of the opening on February the 5th, giant exhibition banners were laid out on the steps of the museum, the No U-Turn logo standing out starkly on a dead black background. February is Beijing's cruelest month. In the dry cold, the skin splits on your fingers and static electricity crackles in the air. And yet, despite the grim weather, a large, excited crowd arrived in time for the opening at 9 a.m. The main exhibition hall was dominated by a massive triple portrait of Mao, the standard image rendered in the tones of newsprint and overlaid with a grid, as if someone had produced an image of the chairman from an instruction sheet. It reduced the great leader from an icon to something that could be painted by numbers, a commodity. Around the portrait there was a sense of chaos, as many of the works seemed to mock the very idea of an exhibition and the whole project of reform and opening up. In one corner, an artist sat on a bed of straw surrounded by eggs and a banner with the word, "Waiting." Around his neck, he wore a sign that read, "To avoid disturbing future generations, no debates during the hatching." Another artist set up a stall to sell shrimp and called the work Big Business. Soon hustled away by police for illegal trading, he returned later to put up a sign that read, "Closed for stock taking." Yet, another threw condoms and coins into the air, which fell like confetti on some of the artworks on display. The owner of one of them complained that the condoms were rendering his piece unrecognizable. A little ironic, given his work was a pile of paper pulp, claimed to be the result of putting the history of Chinese painting and the history of modern Western art through a washing machine. The lists of artists involved read like a who's who of today's upper echelons of Chinese contemporary art, their works in 1989 just hinting at the qualities that would one day make them famous. Among them was Zhang Shaogang, who would become China's most famous artist, and who we will meet later in this story. All of these artists, however, even Wang Guangyi, whose portrait of Mao initially dominated the exhibition, were destined to be upstaged by a young artist called Xiao Lu. Her work was titled Dialogue. Installed in a prime position on the ground floor of the museum, it comprised 2 phone booths, each with a mannequin inside. One was a man, the other a woman, both with their backs turned, both on the phone. Between the two was a table backed by a mirror, with a red rotary dial phone, the receiver off the hook. 2 hours into the show, Xiao Lu approached the installation, produced a pistol, and fired 2 shots at it, cracking the mirror and plunging the hall into panic. She later claimed that her act was not meant to be political, that she was simply expressing the impossibility of dialogue between men and women. But in China in 1989, Dialogue was a loaded word. A call for dialogue between the government and the people had been a key theme of river elegy, and it was an idea that was also being promoted by Zhao Ziyang. That Xiaolu's portrayal of a failed dialogue ended in gunfire gave her performance that day the status of a play within a play. The story of the Tiananmen movement acted out in a gallery before it had even occurred. Marx wrote that history repeats itself, first as a tragedy, then as a farce. Here, maxim was reversed. In that year of 1989, the story of dialogue was repeated, first as farce, then as tragedy. As for the exhibition itself, after Xiaolu's intervention it was closed down. The curators gained permission to reopen a few days later, only to be closed down again for good after bomb threats. It hardly mattered. The exhibition had already had its place in history, another way station along the road to the events of June. On April 15, 1989, Hu Yaoban died and the curtain rose. The students knew their history. They knew that mourning for Zhao Enlai had triggered the 1976 Qingming demonstrations, which were harbingers of the fall of the Gang of Four and the rise of Deng Xiaoping and the Reform era. In their mourning for Hu Yaoban, they saw their opportunity to make history. Within hours of the news of Hu's death, posters were going up at Beijing's universities, mourning his passing, but also demanding a reversal of the criticism that had accompanied his fall from power. By the morning of April 17th, students across 26 of the capital's universities had held spontaneous memorials, and the mourning posters had been joined by others launching scathing attacks on the current state of Chinese society. Wreaths and elegiac poems had already appeared around the monument to the people's heroes on Tiananmen Square. After midnight on the night of April 17th, a column of around 1,000 students set out to march the 18 kilometers from Peking University to Tiananmen Square. Passing through the university district, they gathered another 2,000 students, marching behind a banner proclaiming Hu Yaoban, the soul of China. Arriving at Tiananmen Square before dawn, they hung their banner from the monument to the people's heroes and together sang the International. Arise, ye prisoners of starvation, arise, ye wretched of the earth. If Nothing to My Name would be the anthem to the student movement, the International would be its hymn. It was a song everyone knew, students, workers, ordinary Beijingers. By singing it, they linked themselves to revolutionary movements around the world and to the noble history of struggle that had given birth to modern China. They would sing it often over the next fevered weeks, even as they were surrounded by soldiers and tanks on their last night in Tiananmen Square. From this distance, you can see how the whole tragedy played out, from the moment of elation before dawn on April 18th to the desperate denouement in the dark hours before dawn on June 4th. You can see the bad decisions, the bad luck, the forks in the road where a different choice would have changed the outcome. By the end, less than 2 months later, some students were speaking openly of dying for their cause. But on that spring morning in April, they felt only excitement and self-confidence. The students announced their demands, which they drew up into a formal petition. They asked for the affirmation of Hu Yaoban's views on democracy and freedom, for the repudiation of the campaigns against spiritual pollution and bourgeois liberalization, and the rehabilitation of those who had suffered under them, for the public declaration of assets of government leaders and their families, for freedom of speech and the press, and increased funding for education. The students then began a sit-in in front of the Great Hall of the People, the seat of China's parliament, the National People's Congress, to wait for a response. Tensions grew as the students waited. Some junior officials were sent to receive the petition, but the students wanted to hand it to someone in authority. That night they dramatically upped the ante by moving their demonstration to the real seat of power, the leadership compound of Zhongnanhai, just west of the Forbidden City. On the night of April 18th, and then again on the night of April 19th, some 2,000 students stood at the gates of Zhongnanhai and, surrounded by spectators, called for Premier Li Peng to come out and meet them. There were chaotic scenes as some surged toward the gates and were only held back with difficulty by lines of police. Inside Zhongnanhai, a split was already opening up in the leadership. In the face of concerns from the old guard, Zhao Ziyang argued that the students' stance should be considered patriotic, despite the actions of a rowdy minority, and that their right to memorialize Hu Yaoban should be respected. His premier, Li Peng, urged a hard line. At the base, the split reflected a dramatic difference of outlook between the two men. Zhao Ziyang was interested in the potential for dialogue between the regime and the people as a way of advancing reform in the rule of law. Li Peng was aligned with the old guard, who were keen to put a brake on reform, re-establish old-style central planning, and put an end to the bourgeois liberalism. Li's approach was traditional and autocratic. The Communist Party equaled the people. What need was there to negotiate with themselves? Back at the universities, the situation was evolving fast. The students were already setting up an independent organization to lead their movement, turning their back on the official student bodies sanctioned by the party. The leaders of these new unions would become the face of the student movement in the following weeks. Earnest, intelligent, passionate advocates whose prominence would earn them a place on the most wanted list after June 4th. The official memorial service for Hu Yaoban was set for April 22nd at the Great Hall of the People. The students began gathering on Tiananmen Square before dawn, their numbers swelling to the tens of thousands as the service began. Inside the hall, 4,000 official mourners, including Deng Xiaoping, listened as Zhao Ziyang delivered the eulogy, which was broadcast to the silent crowd outside. At the end of the ceremony, 3 students climbed the stairs to the entrance of the hall and knelt, the central figure holding aloft their petition, entreating Premier Li Peng to come out to meet them. It was a shocking gesture. Petitioning on bended knee was an echo of China's imperial past and a dramatization of the true balance of power in this nominal People's Republic. The students knelt on the steps for half an hour, but no one came. It would prove to be the first in a string of mistakes, when chances for dialogue and reconciliation were squandered. Many watching on were enraged that Li Peng would let the students humiliate themselves in this way and not respond. Many in the square wept. The students' kneeling figures, seeming so tiny on the grand steps, became a symbol of the indifference of the government and swelled the ranks of popular support for the students' cause. The very next day, an even graver mistake was made. Zhao Ziyang left the country for a week-long state visit to North Korea, leaving Li Peng in charge. Allies in the leadership urged him to cancel the trip, but he was concerned at the message of crisis that would send. Before leaving, he believed he had won support from the leadership for his plan to address the student movement through serious dialogue between the government and the student leadership. But in the week he was gone, the balance of power would move decisively to the hardliners, and on his return he would never regain the upper hand. Guo Jian did not see the students kneeling that day. Instead, he was herded with his campus classmates to watch the official broadcast on television. The university administration was determined to stop their students from joining the demonstrations and had even locked the gates to the grounds. But when Guo Jian heard the students from Peking and Tsinghua universities marching past 3 days later, he just scaled the wall and jumped. At first, he walked along beside the marchers, not yet ready to join their ranks. The students had announced a mass boycott of university classes, a strike that would last until their petition was answered. There were lots of police on the streets, but he noticed that even they seemed to be supporting the students. Once at Tiananmen Square, he roamed around, observing, yet still hanging back. But when he returned to campus, he saw a notice calling for Minzu University students to march to the square, and he immediately went to his class studio to paint a poster. After a bit of thought, he decided on a simple slogan, "Long live teachers." Surely, he thought, that wouldn't get him into much trouble. Although he tried to convince his classmates to prepare their own posters, as they set off, he found a group of them trailing empty-handed in his wake, placing him in the unwanted role of leader. They marched through the streets lined by ordinary Beijingers who urged them on, gave them the thumbs up, even handed them drinks. Arriving at the square, Guo Jian tried to convince his classmates to return to campus instead of joining the sit-in on the square. He had a feeling that the police would be sent in to clear them that night. Despite his fear, he decided to stay out himself, and he watched the dawn come over the square without violence. But in the morning came grim news. It had been broadcast overnight, and now it was emblazoned across the front page of People's Daily. The mouthpiece of the Communist Party had delivered its official damning verdict. The student movement, the paper's editorial declared, was aimed at creating turmoil in the country and must be resolutely opposed. The use of the word turmoil, donglan, was chilling. The period of the Cultural Revolution was routinely referred to as the 10 years of turmoil, and the editorial had deliberately drawn a line between the students' actions and the worst events in Chinese modern history. To see the People's Daily headline shriek, "We must resolutely oppose turmoil," was profoundly shocking and frightening. But if linking their idealistic movement to the horrors of the Cultural Revolution was bad, the rest of the editorial was worse. The paper denounced the student movement as a planned conspiracy by a small group of people to negate the leadership of the party and the socialist system itself, and to put at risk the whole project of reform and opening up. The students' demonstrations, independent unions, and boycotts were all specifically condemned. The message had to have come from the top of the party, direct from the mouth of Deng Xiaoping. At the stroke of a pen, the students found themselves labeled as counter-revolutionaries. "We were very scared when we saw the editorial," Guo Jian told me, "and we felt cornered. It made people want to stay in Tiananmen Square." Everyone was talking about an expression in Chinese, 秋后算账, which literally means, "we'll settle up after the autumn harvest," but carries a menacing subtext of squandering accounts when the time is ripe. "We believed if we left the square and went back to our campuses," Guo Jian said, "they might not come for us straight away, but in the end, they would come." From April 26 on, the editorial became the primary consideration in the students' strategy. While it stood, they could not simply return to campus. They had to press forward. In China, Guo Jian told me, people know the best way to stay safe is to make something bigger to be safe in a crowd, to find protection by being surrounded by other people. The students decided to ramp up the pressure. The next day, students streamed out of colleges and universities all over Beijing, heading for Tiananmen Square. But this time, they weren't alone. They were joined by their teachers, by journalists, and by the ordinary workers and citizens of Beijing, all angered by the editorial and chanting, "Patriotism is not a crime." By the time they reached the city center, their numbers had swelled to 100,000. They marched under the hot sun, alternately singing and chanting, while people on the pavements applauded or pressed cold drinks and popsicles into their hands. The students carried collection boxes and found them stuffed with cash. When they reached the police blockade, they simply pushed through it to the square, and the police, though standing 4 deep, let them go. As they flowed into the square, they felt that April 27th marked a great victory. Their teachers were with them, and it seemed the people of Beijing were too. But now what? Zhao Ziyang arrived back in Beijing on April 30th. By this time around, 90,000 students were boycotting their classes. No meaningful dialogue had been held, and the anniversary of the May 4th movement was looming. The deep divisions in the leadership were now clear for all to see. Li Peng and his fellow hardliners had taken advantage of Zhao Ziyang's absence to convince Deng Xiaoping that the students' movement was dangerous. At a special briefing at Deng's home, they played up the most inflammatory words and actions of the students and convinced him that the movement concealed plots seeking to stir up turmoil, to bring down the party and the whole socialist system. Having urged him to such a conclusion, they rushed to get it into print. From the moment he arrived back in Beijing, Zhao Ziyang looked for a way to overturn the editorial. He knew that the only person who could sanction this was Deng Xiaoping. But Deng, he was told, was too ill to receive him. At the time, Zhao Ziyang commanded a bare majority in the top leadership group of the party. On the 5-man Politburo Standing Committee, he commanded 3 votes, and his rival, Premier Li Peng, had 2. But Li Peng had powerful support among the old guard in the party, those elders who had officially retired from public life, but still exercised influence. Most crucially, he now seemed to have won the support of Deng Xiaoping, on whom Zhao had previously been able to rely. At a meeting of the Politburo Standing Committee on May 1st, Zhao argued for more transparency and consultation in political life, for a guarantee of freedom of speech, and for a country that was truly governed by law. Li Peng countered that stability must be assured before there could be any talk about reforming the political system. Privately, Zhao Ziyang tried to persuade Li Peng that the People's Daily editorial must be revised, but he refused to budge. In the face of this, Zhao decided that he would play down the editorial by setting a new tone himself. On May 3rd, he gave a speech commemorating the anniversary of the May 4th movement. In it, he specifically endorsed the patriotism of the students, the validity of their calls for greater political participation, and their opposition to corruption. He doubled down the next day with a nationally televised speech along the same lines at a meeting of the Asian Development Bank, in which he specifically supported dialogue with the students. On May 4th, the students held another rally in Tiananmen Square. Again, they marched there in their tens of thousands, flowing through police lines like water. Again, the people of Beijing turned out to support them with food and drink. The charismatic 21-year-old student leader, Wu Kaishi, was carried toward the square on the shoulders of his classmates, waving a red flag, his flamboyance and exuberance capturing the triumphant mood of the day. The students declared themselves the heirs of the great patriotic May 4th movement, reiterated their key demands, and then announced their intention to return to classes and await the promised dialogue. But even as Zhao Ziyang worked to calm the students' situation, he was being undermined. Since before his North Korea trip, he had been directing that there be dialogue with the students, but those tasked with the job by Li Peng were doing everything they could to block and ultimately destroy the process. The students waited for more than a week for the dialogue to begin. Finally, out of frustration and fear, with no sign of dialogue in sight, they decided on a dramatic new course. On May 13th, they announced a hunger strike. The students now listed only two demands: that the People's Daily editorial be repealed, and that the government hold televised talks with the students. They knew Mikhail Gorbachev was due to arrive in Beijing in just 2 days' time. Surely under this pressure the government would act. The hunger strike was a fatal decision. When the students commandeered Tiananmen Square for this protest and refused to move aside even for the arrival of Gorbachev, they doomed both their movement and the reformists led by Zhao Ziyang. Within days, martial law would be declared, Zhao Ziyang toppled, and the clock would begin its countdown to the bloody climax of June 4th. And yet, the hunger strike would inspire the most extraordinary and beautiful days in the history of Beijing as the city rose in solidarity. Teachers, parents, shop and factory workers, farmers, government officials, journalists, taxi drivers, even police marched in support of the students under banners which proudly proclaimed their occupations and workplaces. Even journalists from People's Daily marched under a banner that read, "We did not write the editorial." On May 17th and May 18th, days 5 and 6 of the hunger strike, more than 1 million people marched in the capital. Tens of thousands of supporters from around the country flocked into Beijing, and for a few short days, censorship was lifted and the Chinese media reported freely on the events. These were the largest spontaneous demonstrations in Chinese history. They were not the organized massed rallies of the Cultural Revolution, which had filled Tiananmen Square with ranks of hysterical teenagers. These were the hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of individuals choosing to stand up in support of a movement that they had taken to their hearts. For a brief moment, it seemed that China was on the verge of an extraordinary change. Tiananmen Square turned into a mass encampment. Up to 3,000 hunger strikers lay in makeshift tents or in the public buses that the students had commandeered, while tens of thousands of supporters thronged around them in the heat, breaking occasionally into song, or dancing to music that blared out from portable tape recorders. The music was punctuated by the wailing of sirens as ambulances ferried collapsed hunger strikers to hospital, the sight of medical workers in crisp white uniforms, red crosses pinned to their sleeves, carrying pale and painfully young students on stretchers to ambulances, was heartbreaking and inspiring. The strikers wore white headbands on which they had written slogans in stark black ink. Guo Jian, who had joined the hunger strike, chose an inspiring phrase he had read somewhere. He gathered, he told me years later, it was a quote from some foreign writer. "If I don't have freedom, I'd rather die." I think that's what it said, he told me. "Give me liberty or give me death," I suggested. "Yes, that was it," he said. As he lay in one of the buses, friends came by to sign his sweat-stained headband. My oldest Chinese friends, the young artist and his feisty girlfriend, who had entertained me in their tiny Hutong home just over 3 years before, were now living apart. He had chosen exile in Australia at the beginning of the year, hoping to make his way as an artist there. She had remained in Beijing, holding true to her dream of a bohemian life in the capital. The student movement took her by storm. "It was so exciting to feel really part of something for the first time," she told me later. "To believe you could make a difference, that you could change things, that you were making something happen, something for the country." Every day she met her friends in the square to discuss ideas. It was like an open-air university crossed with Woodstock. She sent a letter to her boyfriend in Australia, predicting that the students would prevail. "We will celebrate a great victory," she wrote. She was shocked to find Guo Jian among the hunger strikers. He had seemed like such a quiet boy when she had first met him. It was amazing to see him transform into an activist. But then, that's what it was like in those days.